The office was empty, the lights were low, and when she leaned close and whispered, "Consider this your reward for staying late," I realized some moments change you, not because of what's given, but because of what's finally seen. By the time the clock slipped past 9, the office no longer felt like a workplace, it felt like a pause in the world. The usual rhythm of phones ringing and keyboards clacking had faded into a soft, electric hush. Only a few ceiling lights remained on, casting long reflections across polished desks and glass walls. Outside the windows, the city breathed slowly, traffic lights blinking like tired eyes. I stayed because the work mattered. Or at least, that's what I told myself. The truth was more complicated. Staying late felt easier than going home to silence. It felt purposeful. Grounded. And tonight, I wasn't alone in choosing that. She was still there too. My boss sat at her desk a few rows away, posture straight but no longer rigid. The sharp lines she carried during the day had softened. Her blazer rested on the back of her chair, sleeves of her blouse rolled just enough to reveal her wrists, small details I'd never noticed before because I'd never had the time, or the quiet, to notice anything beyond professionalism. I tried to focus on my screen, but the silence had a way of pulling attention outward. Every small sound felt magnified, the gentle tap of her pen against the desk, the slow exhale she let out as she leaned back, the faint rustle of papers being stacked with care. It struck me then how composed she always was, and how much effort that composure must take. When she finally stood, stretching her shoulders with a subtle wince, I felt it before I understood it, a shift. Not dramatic. Just human. She glanced over at me, and for a moment, we shared something unspoken, the understanding of long days, of responsibility that didn't clock out. "You're still here," she said, not as a question. "So are you," I replied, smiling before I could stop myself. She returned it, small, genuine. The kind of smile that doesn't perform, that doesn't need approval. It made the room feel warmer. As she walked past, her heels were quieter than usual on the carpet. She paused beside my desk, looking down at my work. I felt her presence before I felt her touch, the way the air shifted, the faint, comforting scent of her perfume, understated and familiar in a way that felt earned. Her hand rested briefly on the back of my chair. Not heavy. Not lingering too long. Just enough for me to feel the warmth through fabric, grounding me in the moment. My shoulders relaxed without my permission. The office didn't feel empty anymore. It felt shared. I was aware, suddenly, of everything, how close she stood, how calm her breathing was, how different this version of her felt from the woman who commanded rooms during the day. This wasn't authority. This was presence. And as I sat there, under the quiet lights, with the city watching from beyond the glass, I realized that staying late had already given me something unexpected, a glimpse behind the role, into the person. A moment where time slowed, and the distance between professional lines softened, not crossed, just gently blurred. The glow of the office wasn't just from the lights overhead. It was from the quiet understanding forming in the space between us, unspoken, patient, and waiting. She didn't move away right after reviewing my screen. Instead, she stayed, eyes scanning the work with a level of attention that felt personal. Not rushed. Not distracted. It was different from the quick approvals she gave during the day, when time always pressed in on her from every direction. Tonight, her focus felt like a gift. "You handled this well," she said quietly. Most people would have cut corners just to finish. The words settled deeper than praise usually does. Maybe because they weren't spoken in a meeting room or typed into an email. Maybe because there was no audience, no performance required. Just honesty. I straightened slightly, glancing up at her. "I wanted to get it right." She nodded, as if that answer mattered more than the result itself. Her hand was still resting on the back of my chair. I became aware of the subtle pressure of her fingers, relaxed but intentional. It wasn't possessive. It felt steady. Like she was anchoring herself as much as she was grounding me. I wondered if she noticed how close she was standing, how easily I could feel her warmth in the quiet space between us. She leaned in just a little, pointing to a line on the screen. This part, your approach here, it shows patience. That's rare. Patience. I wasn't used to being described that way. The word echoed in my chest, reshaping how I saw myself. When she withdrew her hand, it felt like a small shift in gravity, as if the room had exhaled and taken something with it. I swiveled my chair slightly to face her more fully. Up close, I noticed details I usually missed, faint lines at the corners of her eyes that deepened when she smiled, the way her hair framed her face in soft waves, imperfect in a way that made her feel more real. There was confidence there, yes, but also something gentler, something carried rather than worn. You didn't have to stay, she said. But you did. I wanted to help, I replied. Then, after a pause, more honestly, and I didn't mind. That seemed to surprise her. Not dramatically, just a brief stillness, a thoughtful look passing across her expression. She crossed her arms loosely, then uncrossed them, as if deciding how open to be in this moment. People notice effort, she said. Even when they don't say it out loud. Her gaze held mine a second longer than necessary. In that second, the office felt smaller. Quieter. Charged in a way that had nothing to do with fluorescent lights or deadlines. She pulled a chair from the adjacent desk and sat beside me, close enough that our knees were nearly aligned. The space between us felt deliberate, carefully measured. She rested her hands in her lap, fingers interlaced, and for the first time I sensed something beneath her composure, a quiet vulnerability, carefully managed but present. This, she said, gesturing lightly toward my screen, is good work. I want you to know that. The recognition lingered, not just in her words, but in the way she said them. In the way she stayed seated beside me afterward, letting the silence stretch without rushing to fill it. In that moment, the reward wasn't something given or taken. It was the feeling of being seen, truly seen, by someone who understood the cost of effort, and chose to acknowledge it anyway. The silence that followed her words didn't feel empty, it felt intentional. Like we had both stepped into a space that existed just outside the rules of the day. The office lights hummed softly above us, but everything else seemed to fade, as if the building itself was holding its breath. She stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her blouse, then moved closer to my desk again. Not hurried. Not hesitant either. Just deliberate. I felt my pulse shift before she even spoke, my body reacting to the awareness of her nearness. When she leaned in, it wasn't obvious. Anyone passing by, if there had been anyone, would have seen nothing unusual. Just a manager reviewing work. Just professionalism. But there was nothing ordinary about the way she lowered her voice. Consider this your reward for staying late. The words were soft, almost private enough to belong only to us. Her lips were close to my ear, close enough that I felt the warmth of her breath brush my skin. A faint trace of her perfume lingered, something subtle and calm, not meant to announce itself, only to be noticed by someone paying attention. For a moment, I forgot how to respond. Not because the words were shocking, but because they carried layers. They weren't an invitation. They weren't a promise. They were something quieter, and somehow more powerful. I turned my head slightly, careful not to move too much. Our eyes met, closer now than they had been all night. Her expression was composed, but her gaze held something different, curiosity, maybe, or trust. The kind that doesn't rush ahead, but waits to see if it's safe to stay. My heart was loud in my chest. I wondered if she could hear it. I wondered if she felt the same subtle shift I did, the sense that something had changed not because of action, but because of intention. What do you mean? I asked, keeping my voice steady. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she straightened just enough to give us space again, as if she were reminding us both where we were. Her hand rested briefly on the edge of my desk, fingers relaxed, close enough that I could have reached out, but didn't. Sometimes, she said, people think rewards are big things. Obvious things. A pause. I think they're usually quieter than that. Her eyes dropped to the screen, then back to me. In that glance, I felt seen in a way that went beyond work. Not assessed. Not evaluated. Understood. The whisper replayed in my mind, not as temptation, but as recognition. She wasn't offering something improper. She was offering presence. Trust. The acknowledgement that staying late had brought us to this moment where masks slipped just enough to reveal something real. I realized then that the closeness wasn't about proximity. It was about permission. Permission to be human in a place that rarely allowed it. As she stepped back, the space between us returned, but it didn't feel like distance anymore. It felt charged, alive with possibility. The whisper lingered, not in my ear, but somewhere deeper, settling into me with quiet certainty. Whatever this was, it wasn't rushed. It wasn't careless. It was the beginning of something slow, intentional, and carefully held, spoken softly, so only those meant to hear it ever would. The moment shifted without announcement. No single word caused it, just the way conversation loosened, drifting naturally away from tasks and timelines. She remained beside me, not checking the clock, not gathering her things. That alone felt like a choice. "Do you ever notice," she said, eyes resting on the dark window, "how quiet gets heavier the longer the day is?" I followed her gaze to the city lights below. "Yeah," I said. "It's like everything you didn't have time to feel finally catches up." She smiled at that, not wide, not polite. Real. Exactly. We talked then, slowly, carefully at first. About work, yes, but also about what work costs. She spoke of responsibility in a way that wasn't impressive, just honest. Of always needing to be composed, decisive, steady. Of how people assume confidence means certainty, when sometimes it's just endurance practiced over time. As she spoke, her hands rested loosely in her lap, fingers occasionally brushing together as if grounding herself. I noticed the way her shoulders softened when she admitted things she probably didn't say out loud often. There was strength there, but it wasn't rigid. It was flexible, earned. "I don't mind being strong," she said. "I just forget sometimes that I'm allowed to be tired." The words settled quietly between us. I found myself leaning in, elbows resting on my knees, fully present. "You don't seem tired," I said, then added more carefully, "but I can tell you carry a lot." Her eyes met mine, and for a moment she didn't look away. There was a pause, long enough to feel deliberate. Then she nodded, once. "You're observant," she said. Not surprised. Almost appreciative. Our knees were close now. Not touching, but close enough that the warmth between us felt shared. When she laughed softly at something I said, she instinctively lifted a hand, then let it fall back into her lap, as if catching herself mid-gesture. The restraint made the moment feel more intimate, not less. I became aware of my own hesitation, the quiet voice reminding me of lines and perceptions. Of what this might look like from the outside. But another voice spoke too, steadier and more grounded. It reminded me that connection doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives through listening. "I don't usually talk like this at work," she said after a while. "Me neither," I replied. That earned another smile. This one lingered. The honesty between us wasn't dramatic. It didn't spill out all at once. It moved gently, like water finding its level. In that shared quiet, I felt the difference between attraction and intimacy. Attraction pulls. Intimacy invites. When she shifted slightly closer, our knees finally brushed, brief, accidental, undeniable. Neither of us moved away. The contact sent a subtle awareness through me, not rushed or overwhelming, just present. Real. In that moment, the age difference revealed itself not in years, but in experience. She had learned how to guard herself. I was learning when it was worth staying open. And sitting there together, under dim lights and shared honesty, it felt like we were meeting not as roles, but as people, choosing to be seen without certainty of where it might lead. The closeness lingered after our knees brushed, not as a spark that demanded action, but as a quiet awareness that asked for care. I felt it in the way my breathing slowed, in the way the room seemed to narrow until it held only us and the space between. This was the moment where things could tilt, where meaning could be misunderstood if we weren't careful. She noticed it too. She shifted back slightly, just enough to restore a measured distance, and I respected her for it. For the restraint. For the choice. It reminded me that intimacy wasn't about how close you could get, but about how thoughtfully you moved within that closeness. "I should probably let you finish up," she said softly, though she didn't stand yet. The words felt like a test, not of desire, but of intention. I hesitated, then spoke before I could overthink it. "I appreciate tonight," I said. "Not just the work part." Her gaze lifted, attentive but calm. "What part, then?" "The honesty," I replied. "It means more than you probably realize." She considered that, eyes steady, searching not for weakness but for clarity. I felt exposed in a way that didn't scare me. This wasn't about wanting something. It was about acknowledging what already existed. Slowly, deliberately, I reached out, not toward her, but toward the edge of the desk between us, resting my hand there. A neutral space. An invitation without assumption. After a moment, she mirrored the movement, placing her hand beside mine. Close enough that our fingers nearly touched. Nearly. The restraint in that small gap felt powerful. Charged. Respectful. "You're easy to talk to," she said quietly. "That doesn't happen often for me." Something softened in my chest. "You're easier to listen to than you think." Her lips curved into a smile that held both warmth and caution. She turned her hand slightly, and for just a brief moment, her fingers brushed mine. The contact was light, unmistakable. Warm. It sent a steady calm through me, not urgency. Then she withdrew her hand. Not abruptly. Thoughtfully. "That's as far as we go tonight," she said, "not as a rule, but as a mutual understanding." I nodded. "I know." And I did. The boundary didn't feel like rejection. It felt like trust. Like something being protected because it mattered. She stood then, picking up her blazer, and I stood with her. For a second, neither of us moved toward the door. The air felt full, of words unsaid, of possibilities held gently back. "Thank you for staying," she said again. This time, I understood what she meant. As she walked away, I didn't feel left behind. I felt grounded. Certain that whatever this connection was, it wasn't fragile. It didn't need to be rushed or proven. It could wait. The boundary we respected didn't close a door, it defined the shape of the space we were building. And in that quiet understanding, the tension didn't fade. It deepened. The quiet stretch of time after she stood felt almost sacred. The office was dim, the hum of electronics low, the city outside blinking indifferently as if it didn't notice the shift in our little world. I stayed where I was, pretending to focus on the screen, though every sense was alert to her next movement. She didn't rush. She walked slowly toward the exit, her heels barely making a sound on the carpet. I rose to follow, and for a moment, we walked side by side, not too close, not too far, just balanced in a careful rhythm of shared space. It wasn't a hallway for words, but a passage for thought. "About earlier," she said, glancing at me from the corner of her eyes, "I want to make sure you understand what I meant by that reward." Her tone wasn't defensive, or distant, just steady. Measured. Like someone revealing a layer, but not the whole story. I nodded, uncertain if I should speak first. "I don't hand out rewards lightly," she continued. "And not all rewards are material or obvious." She paused, letting the words hang in the faint light. "Some are, trust. Recognition. A moment where someone is allowed to see a side of me few ever get to see." Her words sank in. They weren't flirtation. They weren't a test. They were a quiet acknowledgement that I had been present, not just in work, but in noticing her, the person behind the office persona. "You stayed late, yes," she said, "but it wasn't the work alone I appreciated. It was, you. Paying attention. Being patient. Observing carefully. We walked past the empty conference rooms, past the row of cubicles that seemed frozen in time, and I felt the meaning settle in me. The reward wasn't about favoritism. It wasn't about bending rules. It was about understanding. Connection. A subtle bridge being built between us in the softest, most deliberate way. You don't have to act on anything you don't feel ready for, she added, her voice lowering almost to a whisper. And you don't have to define this tonight. Some things are worth waiting for. Her hands rested lightly on the straps of her bag as she prepared to leave the office. I noticed the ease in her posture, the quiet confidence, and the trace of vulnerability that lingered like a shadow in the corners of her eyes. I wanted to say something more, but instead I allowed the silence to speak. Sometimes, she had shown, silence could be louder than words. It could be a shared understanding that required no explanation. Thank you, I finally said. For letting me be part of this moment. Her eyes softened. Then consider that part of the reward, too. A small, sincere smile curved her lips, gentle enough to linger in my chest long after the lights dimmed. When we stepped outside into the night, the cool air hit differently now. It was crisp, grounding. Our shoulders brushed, lightly, unintentionally, but it sent a quiet pulse through me. She didn't pull away, I didn't lean closer. We walked together, two people moving carefully in parallel, the night holding the pause we'd earned. It wasn't a spark. It wasn't a surrender. It was something more deliberate, respect, trust, and a subtle acknowledgement of desire that didn't need to be rushed. The reward she whispered about was no longer just a word. It was the awareness that some connections, nurtured slowly and carefully, hold more weight than any fleeting gesture. And tonight, we had taken the first step in defining it, not through action, but through choice. The bridge between us was there, solid and patient, waiting for the next moment we were ready to cross. We paused at the glass doors of the office, the city lights casting faint reflections across the polished floor. Outside, the night air waited, cool, crisp, and honest, like a reminder that the world continued beyond the walls we'd shared. I felt the pull to say something, to define the moment, but she simply looked at me, patient and calm, and let the silence stretch. The air between us was quiet, but charged, not with urgency, but with awareness. Every subtle shift, every breath seemed amplified in the stillness. Her hair caught the streetlight for a moment, a soft halo that made her look less like the boss I'd known all day, and more like someone entirely human, complex, graceful, and unguarded. You did well today, she said quietly, breaking the pause. Not as praise, not as obligation, but as an acknowledgement of presence. She didn't need to qualify it. I understood that her words were both recognition and a gentle reassurance. I wanted to say something equally quiet, something honest. I appreciate tonight. Not just for work, but for this. My words faltered, but she didn't interrupt. She let them settle, as if hearing them was enough. She stepped closer. Just a fraction. Her shoulder brushed mine lightly, accidental, yet deliberate enough to send a warmth through me. I felt my chest tighten, not in longing, but in recognition of the depth of the trust she had placed in me. Then she did something small, deliberate, and entirely human. She opened her arms for a hug. I paused for a heartbeat, aware of the restraint that had defined our evening, but the invitation was soft, non-pressuring, and I stepped in. Her arms slipped around my shoulders, and I rested my hands at her back, careful and steady. The embrace wasn't long. It didn't need to be. I could feel her steady breath, the subtle rhythm of her heartbeat. For a fleeting moment, the entire day, the stress, the silence, the whispers, and the quiet admissions, condensed into that connection. It was comforting. Grounding. Honest. When we pulled back, she didn't rush away. Instead, she leaned just close enough to place a brief kiss on my cheek. Not teasing. Not provocative. Meaningful. Gentle. Intentional. The warmth lingered on my skin, on my memory, long after her lips had left. You should go home, she said softly, smiling in a way that carried both affection and restraint. "We'll pick up tomorrow." I nodded, understanding that this wasn't a farewell or a beginning, but a continuation, careful, deliberate, and patient. The age difference, the positions, the world outside the office, they weren't barriers, they were context. A shared respect that made this connection real. As I stepped into the night air, the chill pressed lightly against my skin, reminding me that the world waited outside. But I felt warmer. Fuller. Seen. Heard. A part of something quietly significant. The bridge we had begun to build tonight wasn't defined by haste or passion. It was defined by presence, honesty, and respect. Every glance, every touch, every unspoken word had contributed to a moment that was complete, self-contained, and entirely ours. And as I walked away, the city around me humming softly, I realized that some rewards, like this one, aren't given with grand gestures. They're earned in trust, nurtured in patience, and held in the quiet moments when two people choose to be truly seen. Tonight, I had been seen. And that was more than enough.